How's it going, everyone? Jiivita here with a overview for testing 224. This is the long anticipated farming update. However, this also adds a whole lot of other cool things such as new fluids, placeable fluids, an overhaul to the lighting system, and of course, well, farming related skills and farming related tools, etc. So pretty awesome. I just have to brag a little bit on the lighting system. It just it's subtle, but it just makes all of the colors really pop. Shiny blocks are not only shiny, but they have kind of a world reflection in them, which just adds a really sort of nice richness to these types of materials and pops up in a lot of blocks, items, machines, etc. So you might find yourself doing kind of some double takes here and there of like, oh wow, that's a little bit different, a little bit richer, you know, bolder, etc. But let's get down to business here. We have essentially 4 types of farming depending on how you kind of look at things. The 4th type of farming is not implemented just yet. That is crops that are grown solely for prestige or prestige giving crops that are kind of decorative. But the first type of farming is the organic farming. This is basically your food items, kind of what you might expect. So we have our earth yams, so we have our basic earth yams followed by waxy and exotic. We now have 3 new grains, or kind of replacement for, I guess, the old grains, but we have the Oryza ortiva, which is essentially rice. We have the Avena ortia, which is essentially oats, which has the added benefit is that you can refine it into milk as well. So that kind of takes some of the pressure off of wild stock and the milk glands to make milk. And then finally we have Chagger Eaterin, which is essentially wheat. So now to make your bag of oats, rice, and flour, you can simply grow these grains. You no longer have to farm grass seeds in order to make those products. And in fact, you can't use grass seed for those products anymore. And then over here, you can grow all 3 different types of starberries. So your basic, glossy, and juicy starberries. And then finally, we have the Kara nut, which is essentially used to make bark, oils for brews like the restorative, boosting oils, things like that. And you can also use it to make wax, which I thought that was pretty interesting. You can still use waxy earth yams to make wax, but now you can also use this as well. So pretty awesome. Originally, earth yams and starberries were going to be removed from leaves and soils respectively. However, they've been re-added in just at a slightly lower drop rate that's more in line with the other extra drops that you can get from blocks. So that mud farm for those exotic earth yams, you'll still be able to do that. It'll just be a little bit less productive to kind of encourage, I guess, the more shift towards farming. So all in all, pretty awesome. And I know I would a lot rather plant crops than to break the same 100 or even 1,000 mud over and over. Moving on to the second type of farming is the inorganic farming, which includes kindling mass and combustion fraction. And I guess depending on how you look at it, goo as well. But I kind of look at that as its own type of farming since it's fairly unique and pretty interesting. But taking a look at kindling mass, these are both fuel types. The kindling mass kind of specializes in making fuels burn faster. So you can use kindling mass to, well, you could use it straight up as a fuel itself, although it's kind of like using, you know, maybe tree trunks as a fuel. It works, but it's not that efficient. But you can add this to any existing fuel such as coals, even peat. I guess you can't really add it to woods, but it'll make it produce a little bit more spark, but the main thing is it'll make it burn much faster. So it'll smelt things faster, get converted into spark faster, so it basically speeds things up. The combustion fraction, on the other hand, is basically something you add to increase the fuel. You can even compact it and use it as its own fuel, which is pretty decent, or you could add it to hard compact coal to make that an even more potent fuel, which then can also be enriched using kindling mass to give it even more potency and speed. So pretty interesting. Then the third type of farming is goo. This is focused around dyeing blocks into other colors, and it's pretty interesting. It grows on the ceiling. Depending on where you plant the goo, it'll actually morph or mutate the color into a different one depending on the atmosphere. So lush and homeworlds have no effect on goo. However, you plant on an elemental, metal, or coal world, it will shift the color in the direction of that atmosphere. So presumably burn planets will shift it towards the red, toxin to green, coal maybe black, metal I'm really not that sure, but anyway, you can over time shift these pigments to a different color. Not to mention, you can come over here and we have two new machines. We have a pigment processor as well as a spray tinter. So these are pretty cool. You can open this up and it's pretty interesting in that you can take this, say, 100 black dye and turn it into essentially 100 color spray. If you have the power coils, you do get a bonus. So I actually get an extra 24 because I have the 24 coils. But you can actually mix pigments together, and it also augments the output as well. So if I put in 200 pigment, I'll get out 200 spray along with my bonus. Not to mention, it also augments the tint of the spray. So if I want a darker red, I simply have to put less red in, or maybe put in more black. So pretty awesome. You can take a look at this. That's going to make a dark red. Let's take out almost all of the red. So that still makes it black. And now we're at a night orange. So you can literally sit here, play with the ratios until you get just the color that you want. So pretty awesome. And once you have the spray, you can simply come over and anything in the world you can then recolor. Well, I say anything, it's anything that's made out of either wood or rock. You can't dye metals or gleams or soils or gravel, at least not yet. But anything that's wood or stone base you can tint, which is pretty awesome. And of course, you can come over here to the spray tinter and put in a whole bunch of wood along with your pigment and start spraying, and it will basically do all that for you so you don't have to click on every single block. And not to mention, it has a pretty cool animation. It is good to note that once you tint a block, it is permanent, at least until you use a different tint on it. Anyway, let's get down to business and take a look at the star of the patch, which is farming. As you might imagine, you're going to run around and look for some wild crops to gather seeds. Once you do find some seeds, you can always put those into an atlas to help you find more of that type of seed. And then finally, you can bring them all home, and pretty much most of them can be planted into soil. So we can take this earth yam seed, just plop it into the soil. However, we do have skills and tools to help us along. So I have a hand till on my right hand, so amusingly I can till this soil even after it's already planted. And if we take a look at the seeds, we can actually see that each seed will give you information on what it actually likes. So this one likes to grow in sunlight or gleam light, so you can plant these underground. Likes to be sown in tilled silty soil and sown near water and sand. But taking a closer look at these seeds, you'll see that each one gives you at least some idea how long it takes to ripen. These earth yams are fairly basic, so it only takes about 3 hours for them to grow. However, it's good to note that this is maybe kind of like an average or an estimation, because the way crops actually grow is that each in-game day, which is about 15 or 20 minutes, something like that, there is a chance for them to advance the next stage. So there's a bit of randomness or RNG involved here. Some crops will actually grow faster than this, while others, if you're unlucky, will grow much slower. As you can see here, there's also options to fertilize, so you can fertilize with mulch or high octane. There's also 2 new skills related to farming. So under crafting, there is now a crop sower, which will increase your crop planting up to 3. You can think of this very much like the cooking skills. Certain crops will require you to have a certain level in crop sowing. But coming down to Epic 2, there's actually the Farming Epic, which sounds pretty vital in that it increases your crop sowing by 2 levels. It also increases the crop yield by 20% and doubles the effectiveness of fertilizer. So your fertilizer is going to do, well, twice the effectiveness or twice the speed, and your yield chance will be increased by 20%. But just keep in mind, if this is anything like the Gathering Epic, that's not 20% more product from your crop. That is that your chance to get extra drops from the crop is increased by 20%. So it is going to increase your yields, but not necessarily by 20%. So if you're on PC, you can open up the debugging menu, scroll down to selection, and then there'll be a section for planted crops either above or below if you're looking at a crop, and you'll be able to see basically how happy it is. This condition growth scale basically is going to tell you whether or not it's going to grow. So if it's at 100%, it will grow. If it's less than 100%, it'll either be slowed down or not grow at all. And then there's condition seed chance and condition yield chance. So yield is the actual product of the crop, which in this case will be earth yams. And then of course seed chance is your chance to get the seed back. I won't get too hung up over numbers right now because the actual balancing of this is a work in progress. However, the general idea is that you will get back less seeds than you use to actually plant the crop. This is because, well, world regeneration is constantly adding seeds into the game, and if farming produced its own seeds, they would become worthless due to overabundance. So I can certainly understand the need for that from an economic standpoint. However, I do have to admit, from a farming standpoint, it seems a little bit odd that either we're really bad farmers and we can't produce a crop that can replenish itself, or there's something wrong with the plants and they can't reproduce adequately, in which case, how is this stuff even growing in the wild? So an interesting bit of a conundrum there. So the general rules for making crops happy is that they like to be planted near their preferred soil, up to 8 blocks of it, up to 3 of their favorite block that they like to be near but not necessarily planted in, and then 3 of whatever their preferred fluid is. So in this case, water. The favorite block is mud right here, and then it likes to be planted in this peaty soil. So I got 8 blocks of peaty soil here. So the preferred block to be planted in, that does have a range of up to 3 blocks away, whereas the water source has a range of 2 blocks. So in other words, just about all crops can be planted in a configuration very similar to this. We have 4 crops right here sandwiched between sand and water, which is kind of a little bit of a pro tip, is that you can chisel essentially stair steps like this, or really any kind of chisel shape, and place water in the chiseled recess. So in essence, you can have 2 blocks occupying the same block space. As you might imagine, this particular setup, I can just run this in a straight line for essentially eternity. And if I want to make it wider, just add another 4 crop spaces here and then sandwich it between another sand and water layer. Arguably, you're wasting a little bit of space by doing this particular method, so you can do kind of a staggered well type system where you stagger these wells back and forth. So this uses 4 blocks of water and 4 blocks of sand for each little well, and yeah, it works pretty well. Takes a little bit more concentration to set up, but arguably is more crops in the same amount of space. Once you have your crops planted in their ideal conditions, you can help them on a little bit extra with some fertilizers. So the first one in basic type is Ocean Mulch. It's got a pretty cool little effect to it, and if you look, it makes these little flower buds ever so slightly brighter. It's pretty subtle, but there is a visual difference. But it's good to note that Ocean mulch can only be used on organic crops. If you want to fertilize your inorganic crops, there is the high octane cultivator. This can be used on organic crops. You can upgrade essentially the fertilizer, so you cannot go backwards once you do the high octane. Not that you would really want to, but it's good to note that the materials used to craft these fertilizers are only found on exoworlds, and they are actually made essentially from the new fluid. So we have primordial resin over here, which I have to say looks pretty amazing. It's kind of like swirling liquid gold is what it looks like to me. And then we have petroleum over here. So the resin is used to make the mulch, whereas the petroleum is used to make the octane. And there are two new forge boons. One is the solidifier used to solidify fluids, and then there's another one that is a fluid breaker that essentially allows you to break fluids into a placeable version of themselves. But this is the solidified version of resin with the solidified version of petroleum right next to it. So pretty awesome. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule, namely the starberry plants as well as goo that actually likes to grow on the underside of blocks. So these starberries like to grow on the underside of these leaves. Their favorite block to be near is this mold, and actually likes to be around empty air, which is why these are staggered the way they are staggered. The crops basically look in a horizontal plane. They don't really look up and down. So in order to make these starberries as happy as possible, they want to be next to at least one other leaf, and they like being next to up to 2 mold, but then pretty much everything else needs to be empty airspace. Moving on to goo, it's planted on the ceiling just like starberries, and it's a pretty interesting one in that it has kind of 2 different ways to plant it. You can plant it to prioritize making pigments, or you can plant it to prioritize making seeds. This is to help you to essentially mutate your pigment seeds into different colors on other planets before actually yielding the main crop to make dye. So this is an example of a setup for making as much pigment as possible. And what's kind of interesting is that it likes to be irrigated with lava. However, if you get it too close to the sponge, which it likes to be planted in, it will actually burn up the sponge. So it has to be at least a block away from the sponge, otherwise it's going to burn it up. If you're going to prioritize making seeds, you'll want something kind of like this, next to a lot of growth and planted on rock. Here's another interesting example of crop diversity. This is essentially rice, which likes to be planted in flowing water. It doesn't want to be completely submerged in water, and in fact, if you place it next to water in that very first flowing block, it doesn't like to be planted there either. However, everywhere else that's flowing water will actually give it a huge growth boost. However, what's really interesting, at least in this current iteration, is that you'll actually get a yield bonus if you harvest the crop out of water. So it encourages you to essentially have a way to drain your field before you harvest it. So you can flood it while it's growing and then drain it to harvest the crop for a bonus. Which kind of lends you to want to play around with fluid mechanics a little bit and make some pretty interesting things, like this particular setup that with one trap door I can cut off the water to all of this field. So while this farm was a lot of fun to set up, my one gripe is that rice is really only used to make the mid-tier food, so the work required to grow this crop efficiently doesn't quite seem to match the end reward. And with the new crops, foliage quality is now more important than ever, so there's extra options in the graphical settings for foliage quality. So the default foliage quality at the lowest setting has had its range increased, but now it actually goes up to 8 different levels. So as you can see, each subsequent level, I can see this crop from farther and farther away until really it's so far away that it's like, yeah, I can tell it's there, but I could barely even really, appreciate it. But then also per pixel lighting has seen a bit of an improvement. There's now a full short range as well as completely off. So if you need to tone some settings back, you could potentially do the short range instead of full and get a slightly better frame rate potentially. So pretty cool. Another amazing thing is that water is much more transparent when it's right up against glass. So in other words, you can make underwater windows to actually be able to see out into, said water from the safety of an air pocket. So with a little bit of creative lighting out in the water, you can make some pretty dramatic scenes. Okay, well that just about wraps up testing 224. One thing I haven't quite talked about is the new placeable fluids. Just to give you a quick rundown, fluids can only be placed inside of beacons and they cannot flow outside of beacons, but fluids cannot be placed in a beacon that is younger than 1 hour old. This is to prevent players from using lava as a weapon, both against meteors and other players. The interactions between lava and other blocks has also been kind of expanded. It can now burn and destroy kind of like grass and wood type blocks. So be careful when trying to place that lava fireplace inside your wood cabin. It might have undesired effects. And then finally, fluids are now fully simulated out in the wild world. This means that if you come across a cave that butts right up against the water source, that water will actually flow into the cave as you might expect in real life-ish. And makes for some pretty amazing caving experiences. But anyway, this was Jiivita. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you want to see more like this, and if there's anything you didn't like, please let me know down below. Also, if you like my channel, want to get cool perks, check out my Patreon page. Until next time, peace.